For 60 years, only one man had ever walked into his first Cup Series start and won it. Then a Kiwi who had never turned a competitive lap on an American oval did it again. No warm-up. No decade of sponsor meetings. No slow climb through the ranks that every single Cup champion before him had been forced to complete. He simply showed up and won. Somewhere inside a NASCAR boardroom, a very expensive spreadsheet just stopped making sense. This is not fiction. This is Shane van Gisbergen, and the system he just exposed has been quietly falling apart for years. Before we get into why that single result has rattled an entire industry, we need to understand the machine he skipped. For decades, NASCAR has run on one accepted formula: a driver enters as a teenager, spends years in trucks, moves to Xfinity, absorbs sponsor money the entire way, and only then earns a Cup seat. It is expensive, slow, and until now, it was considered the only credible route to the top. If you're new here, this channel is NASCAR Voltage, and we break down exactly this kind of story: the numbers, the pressure, and the people behind the headlines. We're closing in on 500 subscribers, and if you want more breakdowns like this one, hitting subscribe genuinely helps this channel grow. Your support is what keeps this kind of research and storytelling coming. Now, back to the system SVG just walked straight past. Two programs built that pipeline and produced real results. The NASCAR Driver Development Program, formerly known as Drive for Diversity, and the Kulvitsky Driver Development Program have spent years identifying young talent and funding their climb through the sport. These programs are not marketing slogans. Kyle Larson and Bubba Wallace Jr. both came through development pathways like these, and both became recognizable names in the sport. That is the proof the system points to whenever anyone questions its cost or its pace. Spend the years, spend the money, and eventually the sport produces a star. That was the deal. Every sponsor who signed on for a multi-year driver development deal did so believing that formula was reliable, and for a long stretch of NASCAR history, it was. Then someone skipped it entirely, and won anyway. The logic behind that traditional formula was never really about talent alone. It was about exposure and repetition. A young driver spends years in trucks learning how a stock car behaves under braking, how tire wear changes handling over a long run, and how oval racing rewards patience over aggression. Xfinity adds a layer of speed and competition close enough to Cup Series level to prepare a driver for the pressure of the top division. Sponsors fund every stage of that journey because the theory is simple: familiarity with American ovals cannot be shortcut, and a driver who skips that familiarity will eventually pay for it in results. That theory is precisely what Van Gisbergen's rise has placed under public examination. While that story was being told as a success, a different story was unfolding underneath it. Concerns have mounted in recent years about the development program's long-term sustainability, with rising costs and increasing difficulty securing sponsorship threatening to restrict access to NASCAR's development ranks. By 2025, a system that once helped launch some of the sport's biggest names was showing visible strain, marked by escalating costs, shrinking sponsorship support, and a growing dependence on pay-to-play arrangements. This is not a rumor or a hot take. It is a documented shift inside a sport that has always relied on corporate money to build its next generation of drivers. An entire pipeline, built on the trust that sponsors would keep funding a decade-long bet on unproven teenagers, was quietly running out of financial oxygen. Pay-to-play arrangements mean a driver's ability to progress through the ranks increasingly depends on how much personal or family sponsorship they can bring to a team, rather than purely on performance. That shift changes who even gets access to the pipeline in the first place, narrowing the pool of talent long before the sport ever gets to evaluate who is actually fastest. A system designed to identify the best young drivers in the country is instead becoming a system that filters for the best funded ones, and that distinction matters enormously when the sport is simultaneously trying to explain why a decade-long, expensive route is still the only credible one. Into that exact moment stepped a driver who owed the traditional American ladder nothing. Shane van Gisbergen did not come from trucks. He came from V8 supercars in Australia and New Zealand, a completely different racing discipline, with a completely different style of car, on a completely different continent. There was no decade of sponsor-funded seasoning behind him when he arrived in NASCAR. What he did have was raw, proven speed. In 2023, Van Gisbergen became the talk of the motorsports world after winning the inaugural Cup Series race at the Chicago Street Course, becoming the first driver since Johnny Rutherford in 1963 to win his very first Cup Series start. 2 years later, in 2025, he recorded 5 wins, the most by a rookie in a single Cup Series season. 10 years of trucks and Xfinity against 0. That is the comparison the entire sport is now quietly sitting with. The Chicago street course win in particular was not a routine result. A street circuit is one of the most demanding formats in motorsport, combining tight, unforgiving barriers with a surface and layout no full-time Cup Series driver had raced competitively before that weekend. Van Gisbergen's win there was not simply a debut victory, it was a debut victory on a track type the entire field was encountering for the first time, which meant the usual advantage held by drivers with years of accumulated NASCAR-specific track knowledge was neutralized. That detail matters, because it removed one of the strongest arguments the traditional pipeline usually relies on, that years of specific American track experience are what separate winners from newcomers. Skeptics could have written this off as one flashy road course specialist getting lucky on a street circuit. Ovals were supposed to be the real test, the place where years of American short track experience should have mattered most. That argument did not hold for long. Fellow driver Ross Chastain addressed Van Gisbergen's oval improvement directly, saying, "I think he's just learned." 3 words, delivered without hesitation, from a driver who has spent his own career racing exactly the kind of ovals Van Gisbergen was supposed to struggle on. Christopher Bell went further, pointing to how much more competitive Van Gisbergen could still become, stating that the format handicaps him tremendously. 2 drivers who came up through the traditional system, both acknowledging that the outsider was closing the gap faster than the sport's old assumptions allowed. The numbers back up what both drivers were describing. Van Gisbergen has recorded 4 oval top 10 finishes in his Cup Series career, and 3 of those came during the 2026 season alone, a sharp acceleration in results from a driver who supposedly lacked the foundational oval experience the sport considers essential. At Atlanta, he ran 3 wide for second place against eventual race winner Ryan Blaney as the field raced toward the white flag, a moment that had nothing to do with road course specialization and everything to do with raw oval racecraft. This was not a novelty act sustaining itself on one signature win. This was a measurable, season-over-season improvement curve, happening in real time, without the traditional pipeline anywhere in the credit column. Consider what the 3-wide move at Atlanta actually required. Running for position that tightly, at that speed, in the closing laps of a superspeedway-style oval, demands split-second spatial awareness and complete trust in a car's handling under extreme drafting pressure. It is precisely the kind of situational instinct that the traditional pipeline argues can only be built through years of exactly this type of racing. Van Gisbergen produced it within his first handful of full-time Cup Series ovals, not his 10th season of them. That is exactly why this terrifies the old model. The entire sponsor pitch that has funded NASCAR's development system for years rests on a simple promise: fund a driver for a decade, and eventually you get a marketable star. Van Gisbergen is now a live, public counterexample to that promise, developing on ovals faster than many pipeline graduates while carrying none of the decade-long cost behind him. And this counterexample is not arriving in a quiet moment for the sport. It is arriving at the exact same time the traditional pipeline is short on sponsorship dollars and struggling to sustain itself. The timing is not incidental, it is the collision of a funding crisis and a walking rebuttal to the reason that funding was supposed to exist in the first place. The pressure is not limited to funding math either. A separate, resurfaced public discourse challenging the athletic credentials of NASCAR drivers has escalated rapidly across recent months, adding another layer of scrutiny onto a sport already defending the value of its own development system. When a sport's legitimacy is being questioned from multiple directions at once, one financial, one athletic, one now developmental, every result gets read through a sharper lens. Van Gisbergen's rise did not create that scrutiny, but it is now unavoidably tangled up in it, because his success raises the uncomfortable question of what, exactly, all that development money was buying. For team owners currently pitching sponsors on multi-year development contracts, that question is not academic. It directly affects how the next funding conversation goes. A sponsorship executive weighing whether to commit 6 or 7 figures to a teenager's decade-long climb now has a recent, well-documented example of a driver who delivered rookie record wins and elite oval racecraft without needing that decade at all. Executives making funding decisions do not need Van Gisbergen's case to be typical. They only need it to be plausible enough to ask harder questions before signing a check. To be fair to the system, Van Gisbergen's story is not a clean case of skipping every structure and winning regardless. Trackhouse Racing still ran him through a development schedule, racing him across all 3 of NASCAR's National Series before handing him a full-time Cup seat. He was not simply dropped into a Cup car with 0 NASCAR laps of any kind. There was a transition period, even if it was dramatically shorter and cheaper than the traditional decade-long American route. And one exceptional international champion, arriving with 3 prior supercars titles already on his resume, is not automatically proof that the entire American ladder is obsolete for every 19-year-old with no top-tier racing background at all. Experience still matters. The counterargument deserves to be taken seriously, not dismissed for the sake of a cleaner story. Van Gisbergen's background also included years of professional racing at the highest level of an entirely different championship before he ever arrived at Trackhouse. 3 supercars titles represent thousands of competitive laps, racecraft under pressure, and experience managing a season-long points battle, none of which shows up in a simple Trucks to Cup chart, but all of which transferred directly into his NASCAR results. A 19-year-old with no equivalent top-tier background would not be walking into the same starting position, even if they skipped the same American ladder. That distinction is exactly why pipeline supporters argue his case cannot be generalized into a blueprint for every future prospect. So where does that leave the sport? The traditional pipeline is real, it is documented, and right now it is financially strained. The counterexample is also real, it is documented, and right now it is winning races on ovals it was never supposed to be competitive on this quickly. Neither fact cancels the other out. NASCAR's development programs still have a track record of producing recognizable stars, and Van Gisbergen's success does not erase that history. But his results do sit as a direct, public challenge to the core assumption that funded that history in the first place, the assumption that only years of expensive, sponsor-backed seasoning can produce a Cup-caliber driver. Is NASCAR's traditional development system genuinely obsolete, or is Shane Van Gisbergen simply the exception that proves why the rule existed for 60 years? That question does not have a clean answer yet, and anyone claiming certainty in either direction is getting ahead of the evidence. What is certain is that a funding model built on patience is now sharing a spotlight with a driver who never asked for any. If this kind of fact-driven NASCAR breakdown is what you come here for, this channel, NASCAR Voltage, is building toward its first 500 subscribers, and every subscribe, like, and comment genuinely moves that forward. Drop your take in the comments. Does the old pipeline still make sense, or has Van Gisbergen already proven it doesn't have to? Comment and share this video if you want more breakdowns like it. If you enjoy real NASCAR breakdowns like this one, you'll like what's coming next.